Matthew Lawson stood in the darkness outside the riverside plantation, his gun steady in his hand, as 40 enslaved souls waited for his signal. The dogs were already barking in the distance, and he knew Edwin Clarke and his hunting party were closing in fast. But Matthew had done this 39 times before, and tonight would be no different. But Matthew had done this 39 times before, and tonight would be no different. He had learned long ago that freedom wasn't given. It was taken, one plantation at a time. The man who once wore chains now wore a reputation that made 200 armed men hesitate before pursuing him into the night. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story of Matthew Lawson began not with triumph, but with the bitter taste of bondage in 1852, on a sprawling cotton plantation in eastern Texas, where the sun beat down mercilessly and the overseer's whip sang a song everyone knew too well. Matthew was 23 years old, his body already marked with scars that told the story of his existence better than words ever could. He had been born into slavery on the Henderson Plantation, a massive expanse of land that stretched across 3,000 acres of prime cotton-growing territory. His mother had died when he was 12, worn down by years of labor in the fields, and his father had been sold off to a plantation in Louisiana when Matthew was just 7 years old. He had no siblings that he knew of, no family to speak of, only the vague memories of his mother's voice singing spirituals in the evening after the day's work was done. The Henderson plantation was owned by Richard Henderson, a man in his 50s who had inherited the land from his father and expanded it through shrewd business dealings and a willingness to work his enslaved workers harder than most. Henderson was not the cruelest owner in Texas, but he was far from kind, viewing the people he owned as investments to be maximized rather than human beings with souls and dreams. He employed 3 overseers to manage the 230 enslaved people who worked his land, and the overseers were chosen specifically for their ability to extract labor through fear and punishment. Matthew had learned early to keep his head down, to work without complaint, and to never meet the eyes of any white person with anything that could be interpreted as defiance. But Matthew was different from many of the others in ways that were not immediately apparent. He possessed a sharp intelligence that he had learned to hide, a mind that absorbed information like cotton absorbed morning dew. He listened when the overseers spoke among themselves, filing away bits of knowledge about the land beyond the plantation, about the towns and cities that existed in a world he had never been allowed to see. He watched how things worked, how the plantation operated, how decisions were made and orders were carried out. He taught himself to read by studying discarded newspapers that sometimes made their way into the slave quarters, practicing letters in the dirt when no one was watching, sounding out words in his mind until they made sense. It was this hidden intelligence that would eventually save Richard Henderson's life and change the course of Matthew's existence forever. The incident occurred on a humid afternoon in July of 1854, when Matthew was 25 years old and had spent his entire life knowing nothing but the boundaries of the Henderson plantation. Richard Henderson had decided to ride out to inspect the cotton fields personally, something he did perhaps once a month to ensure his overseers were maintaining proper discipline and production. He rode a magnificent chestnut stallion named Brutus, a horse he had paid $800 for at an auction in Houston, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never known real danger. Matthew was working in the southern field that day, his hands moving mechanically through the cotton plants as the sun climbed higher in the sky and the heat became almost unbearable. He saw Henderson approaching on horseback, saw the way the man sat tall in his saddle, surveying his domain with the satisfaction of ownership. Matthew kept working, kept his eyes down as he had learned to do, but something made him glance up just as Henderson's horse suddenly reared. A rattlesnake, thick as a man's arm and nearly 6 feet long, had been coiled in the tall grass near the edge of the field, and Brutus had nearly stepped on it. What happened next occurred in the space of a few heartbeats, but Matthew's mind processed it with crystalline clarity. The horse reared high, its front legs pawing the air, and Richard Henderson, caught by surprise, lost his grip on the reins. He fell backward out of the saddle, landing hard on the ground, and the horse, panicked by the snake and now free of its rider's control, brought its hooves down in a frenzy. One hoof caught Henderson in the chest, and Matthew heard the crack of breaking ribs even from 20 feet away. The snake, disturbed by the commotion, began to slither toward the fallen man, its rattle creating a sound that sent chills down the spine of everyone who heard it. Matthew didn't think. If he had stopped to consider the consequences, to weigh the risks, he might have stayed where he was and let nature take its course. But something deeper than rational thought propelled him forward. He ran toward Henderson, grabbing a hoe that another worker had dropped in shock, and brought it down on the snake with all his strength. The blade caught the serpent just behind its head, severing it cleanly, and the body writhed in the grass as Matthew kicked it away from Henderson's prone form. He then grabbed the horse's reins, speaking in low, calm tones until the animal settled, its sides heaving with exertion and fear. Only then did Matthew turn his attention to Richard Henderson, who was gasping for air, his face pale and his eyes wide with pain and shock. Matthew could see that the man's chest was injured, possibly seriously, and that he was struggling to breathe. Without waiting for permission, without considering that touching a white man, especially the master, was itself a dangerous act, Matthew carefully examined Henderson's ribs, feeling for the break through the man's shirt. He had seen enough injuries over the years to know that broken ribs could puncture lungs, could kill a man if they shifted wrong, and he knew they needed to stabilize Henderson before moving him. By this time, others had arrived, including two of the overseers who came galloping up on their own horses, their faces a mixture of concern for their employer and fury at the sight of a slave touching him. One of them, a brutal man named Vincent Crawley who took particular pleasure in administering punishments, raised his whip and would have brought it down across Matthew's back had Henderson not raised a trembling hand and gasped out a single word. "Stop." The word came out barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute authority, and Crawley froze with his whip still raised. Matthew explained quickly what had happened, his words careful and his tone respectful, knowing that even in this moment his life hung in the balance. He told them about the snake, about the fall, about the broken ribs that needed to be wrapped before Henderson could be moved. Crawley wanted to ignore him, wanted to pull Henderson onto a horse immediately and ride for the doctor in town. But the other overseer, a younger man named Patrick Walsh who was marginally less cruel than his colleague, saw the sense in Matthew's words. They sent someone running for cloth to bind Henderson's chest, and Matthew, under their watchful eyes, carefully wrapped the ribs as tightly as he dared, creating a makeshift support that would hold everything in place during the ride to town. Richard Henderson survived the incident, though he spent 3 weeks in bed recovering from his injuries. The broken ribs healed, though they pained him for years afterward whenever the weather turned cold or damp. But more significant than his physical recovery was the change in his relationship with Matthew. Henderson was not a man prone to sentimentality, and he did not suddenly decide that slavery was wrong or that the people he owned deserved their freedom. But he recognized that Matthew had saved his life, that without the quick thinking and action of this particular slave, he would likely have died in that field either from his injuries or from the snake's venom. It created in him a sense of obligation, a debt that sat uncomfortably in his mind because it challenged the fundamental assumptions of the world he lived in. After his recovery, Henderson called Matthew to the main house, an unprecedented summons that had the other enslaved people whispering among themselves about what it might mean. Matthew walked to the house with his heart pounding, knowing that being singled out by the master could lead to reward or punishment with equal likelihood. He was shown into Henderson's study, a room he had never entered before, lined with books and furnished with heavy wooden furniture that spoke of wealth and education. Henderson sat behind his desk, his chest still bound beneath his shirt, and regarded Matthew with an expression that was difficult to read. What followed was a conversation that would echo through the rest of Matthew's life. Henderson asked him questions, probing at the intelligence Matthew had always tried to hide. Where had he learned to handle horses so calmly? How had he known about broken ribs and the danger of moving an injured person too quickly? Could he read? And if so, where had he learned? Matthew answered carefully, honestly, knowing that lies would be detected and would erase whatever goodwill his actions had earned. He admitted to teaching himself to read, to listening and learning whenever he could, to understanding that knowledge was a form of freedom even when physical freedom was impossible. Henderson listened, occasionally nodding, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When Matthew finished speaking, There was a long silence during which the only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Then Henderson made a decision that would change everything. He told Matthew that he was granting him his freedom, that papers would be drawn up and filed with the county courthouse, that from that day forward Matthew would be a free man. But there was a condition, Henderson explained. Matthew could leave, could walk away from the plantation and never look back, or he could stay and work as a paid employee, earning wages that would allow him to eventually buy land of his own. And he could learn, Henderson continued. He could use the plantation's library, could educate himself properly, could develop the intelligence that had saved Henderson's life. Matthew accepted the offer to stay, though not out of loyalty to Henderson or any affection for the plantation that had been his prison. He stayed because he was practical, because he understood that a newly freed black man with no money, no connections, and no place to go would find the world beyond the plantation potentially even more dangerous than the life he knew. He stayed because the offer of education was something he hungered for more than food, more than rest, more than almost anything else. And he stayed because even then, though he could not have articulated it clearly, he sensed that knowledge and skill would be the weapons he would need for the war he was beginning to plan in the depths of his mind. For the next year, Matthew lived in a strange liminal space, free in law but still surrounded by the apparatus of slavery. He worked in the stables, caring for Henderson's horses and learning the skills of an expert horseman. The work was demanding but rewarding in ways that field labor had never been. Matthew learned to recognize the signs of illness in horses before they became serious, to understand the temperament of each animal and how to work with rather than against their nature. He studied the mechanics of saddles and bridles, learning how different equipment affected a horse's performance and comfort. Henderson owned 17 horses, ranging from massive draft animals used for heavy work to sleek riding horses bred for speed and endurance, and Matthew became intimately familiar with each one. He spent his evenings in the library, devouring books on history, geography, mathematics, and anything else he could get his hands on. The library contained perhaps 300 volumes, a modest collection by the standards of wealthy Eastern families, but impressive for rural Texas. Matthew read accounts of the American Revolution and found himself thinking about the parallels between the colonists' fight against British rule and the struggle for freedom that consumed his own thoughts. He studied maps, tracing the routes that connected Texas to other states, to Mexico, to the wider world he had never seen. He worked through mathematics texts, finding a strange satisfaction in the logic and precision of numbers, the way equations always resolved to definite answers unlike the moral ambiguities that filled the rest of his life. Henderson sometimes joined him in the library during these evening sessions, and they would discuss what Matthew was reading. These conversations were awkward at first, both men navigating the unfamiliar territory of intellectual exchange between someone who had been enslaved and someone who had been the enslaver. But gradually, they found a rhythm, debating ideas about governance and justice, about the nature of freedom and the responsibilities that came with it. Henderson never quite acknowledged the fundamental contradiction of his position, maintaining his ownership of other human beings while discussing abstract principles of liberty. But these conversations nevertheless gave Matthew insights into how people like Henderson thought, how they justified their actions to themselves. And he learned to shoot. This last skill came about almost by accident when Henderson, who had taken to occasionally talking with Matthew about matters both practical and philosophical, mentioned that a free man should know how to defend himself. He gave Matthew an old pistol, a Navy Colt that had seen better days, and taught him the basics of loading, aiming, and firing. The first time Matthew held a gun, he felt the weight of it not just physically but symbolically, understanding that this object represented power in its most direct form. Henderson showed him how to load the cylinder with powder and ball, how to set the percussion caps, how to aim using the fixed sights. They practiced behind the stables, setting up targets and shooting until Matthew's hands were steady and his aim was true. Matthew proved to be a natural marksman. His hands, trained by years of delicate work in the cotton fields, were steady and precise. His eyes, sharpened by the necessity of watching for danger in every form, could pick out details at distances that surprised even Henderson. Within a few months, Matthew could outshoot any of the overseers, and Henderson, both amused and impressed, gifted him a better gun, a newer revolver that Matthew maintained with religious care. It was this gun that would become his constant companion in the years to come, the tool that would make him both legendary and feared. But Matthew's education went beyond books and firearms. He watched, always watched, how the plantation operated. He saw how the overseers controlled the enslaved population through a combination of violence, restriction of movement, and the severing of family connections. He observed the network of roads and paths that connected Henderson's plantation to others in the region. He noted which plantations had the most brutal conditions, which owners were the most vicious, which enslaved people were most desperate for freedom. He began to understand the system not just as a victim within it, but as someone studying it from the outside, looking for its weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Matthew developed a systematic approach to gathering information. During his trips to town with Henderson or on errands to other plantations, he would engage people in casual conversation, asking questions that seemed innocent but that gave him crucial intelligence. He learned which plantations were buying new enslaved people and which were selling them off, information that told him about the financial health of different operations and the likelihood of families being separated. He discovered which overseers drank heavily and which were conscientious in their duties, knowledge that helped him identify times when security would be lax. He memorized the layouts of plantation grounds, noting where the slave quarters were located relative to the main house, where the stables and barns were positioned, where the roads led, and what cover the surrounding terrain provided. He also began to understand the economic forces that drove the plantation system. Cotton prices fluctuated based on factors far beyond Texas, influenced by markets in New Orleans and New York and even London. When prices were high, plantation owners expanded operations and treated their enslaved workers slightly better to maximize productivity. When prices fell, owners cut costs and increased pressure on their workers, and the brutality intensified. Matthew realized that these cycles created opportunities, that plantation owners were most vulnerable during economic downturns when their attention was focused on survival rather than security. It was during this time that Matthew met two people who would become crucial to everything that followed. The first was Sarah Jennings, a free black woman who ran a small boarding house in the town of Oak Ridge, about 15 miles from the Henderson plantation. Sarah was in her early 30s, a woman who had bought her own freedom years earlier by working as a seamstress and saving every penny she could. She was smart, resourceful, and connected to a network of free blacks and sympathetic whites who quietly worked to undermine the slave system in whatever small ways they could. Matthew met her when he accompanied Henderson on a trip to town to purchase supplies, and something in her eyes, a fierce intelligence and unbending determination, told him he had found someone who understood the world the way he was beginning to see it. The second was Caleb Moore, a white man in his 40s who owned a small farm on the outskirts of Oak Ridge. Caleb was a Quaker, though he kept his religious affiliation quiet in a region where Quakers were viewed with suspicion for their opposition to slavery. He had moved to Texas from Pennsylvania 5 years earlier, hoping to establish a farming cooperative that would demonstrate the economic viability of free labor, but he had found the social and political environment more hostile than he had anticipated. Caleb was cautious by nature, but he was also deeply committed to his principles, and he used his farm as a way station for people escaping slavery, hiding them in his barn or cellar before passing them along to the next link in the Underground Railroad. Matthew's relationship with both Sarah and Caleb developed slowly, built on careful conversations and the gradual building of trust. He never told Henderson about these connections, never mentioned that his trips to town were about more than purchasing supplies or running errands. Instead, he used his unique position, free but still associated with a plantation, to begin gathering information. The first real conversation Matthew had with Sarah occurred on a hot afternoon in the summer of 1855, when he had been sent to Oak Ridge to purchase leather goods for the plantation's harness repair. He had noticed Sarah's boarding house on previous visits, had seen the steady stream of travelers who came and went, and had recognized that some of those travelers were black people moving with the quiet urgency of those who had something to hide or something to fear. Matthew approached Sarah carefully, initially just making small talk about the weather and the price of goods in town. But Sarah was perceptive, and she saw something in Matthew that made her take a calculated risk. She invited him to sit on her porch and share a cup of water. and during that conversation, she probed gently at his story, asking about his freedom and how he had obtained it, about his plans for the future and what he hoped to accomplish. Matthew answered honestly but carefully, revealing enough to establish his bona fides, but not so much that he would be vulnerable if Sarah turned out to be an informant or someone who could not be trusted. Over the next several months, Matthew and Sarah had perhaps a dozen such conversations, each one going a little deeper, each one revealing more about their respective situations and beliefs. Sarah told him about her network, about the people she helped and the risks she took. She explained how the Underground Railroad worked in Texas, which was more difficult and dangerous than in border states because of the vast distances and the overwhelming hostility of the white population. She shared her frustrations about the limitations of what could be accomplished one person at a time, about the fact that for every person they helped escape, 10 more remained in bondage. Matthew listened and learned, absorbing Sarah's knowledge and experience. He told her about his own observations, about the patterns he had noticed in plantation security, about the vulnerabilities he had identified in the system. They began to discuss hypothetically what it would take to free larger numbers of people, to move beyond the one-by-one rescues that were the norm for the Underground Railroad. These discussions were theoretical at first, explorations of possibility rather than actual planning, but they planted seeds that would eventually grow into Matthew's campaign of systematic liberation. Meeting Caleb more happened through Sarah's introduction. She had mentioned to Matthew that there was a white farmer who was sympathetic to their cause and who might be willing to help in ways that she, as a black woman, even though free, could not. Caleb's farm was positioned strategically, far enough from town to provide privacy, but close enough to major roads to be accessible. More importantly, Caleb had the social standing and the legal protections that came with being a white property owner, things that made it harder for authorities to move against him without solid evidence of wrongdoing. The first meeting between Matthew and Caleb occurred in Caleb's barn on a Sunday afternoon, when Matthew had ostensibly ridden out to look at a plow that Caleb had advertised for sale. The two men sized each other up carefully, each understanding that trust given to the wrong person could lead to imprisonment or death. Caleb was impressed by Matthew's intelligence and his systematic approach to understanding the plantation system. Matthew was reassured by Caleb's genuine commitment to his principles and his willingness to take real risks in service of those principles. By the end of that first meeting, they had established the foundation of what would become a crucial partnership in the years ahead. He learned which plantations in the region were expanding, which ones had recently purchased new enslaved people, which owners were struggling financially and might be inclined to sell. He memorized routes, identified safe houses, and began to sketch out in his mind a network that could move people from bondage to freedom. The turning point came in 1856, 2 years after Matthew had saved Henderson's life and earned his freedom. A new family was brought to the Henderson plantation, purchased at an auction in Houston. The family consisted of a man named Joshua, his wife Rebecca, and their 3 children, the oldest of whom was a boy of 12 named David. Joshua was a skilled blacksmith, which was why Henderson had paid $900 for him, a premium price that reflected his valuable skills. The family was placed in a cabin near the forge, and Joshua was put to work immediately, repairing tools and shoeing horses and making the hundreds of metal items a large plantation required. Matthew met Joshua within days of his arrival, drawn by the sound of the hammer on the anvil and by a curiosity about the newest arrivals. He found a man who was broken in a way that was hard to define, whose eyes held a grief so deep it seemed to have hollowed him out from the inside. Over the course of several conversations, speaking in the low voices of people who knew that walls had ears and that trust was a luxury few could afford, Joshua told Matthew his story. He and his family had been in Maryland, owned by a man who had treated them relatively well by the grim standards of slavery. But that owner had died, and his heir, drowning in gambling debts, had sold off the estate piece by piece. Joshua's family had been separated, his 2 older daughters sold to a plantation in Mississippi, and only through desperate pleading and the intercession of a sympathetic executor had he managed to keep Rebecca and their youngest children with him. But the separation from his daughters was killing him slowly, Joshua confessed. He dreamed of them every night, woke every morning to the fresh wound of their absence, and knew that he would never see them again unless he could somehow buy their freedom, an impossibility given that he owned nothing, not even himself. This conversation planted a seed in Matthew's mind, a seed that grew and flowered into the plan that would define the rest of his life. He began to think systematically about what it would take not just to help one person escape, which the Underground Railroad did regularly with varying degrees of success, but to dismantle the system itself, plantation by plantation, family by family. He thought about the logistics, the risks, the resources that would be needed. And he thought about the fact that he had advantages almost no one else in his position had. He was free, which meant he could travel without papers or explanation. He was educated, which meant he could plan and organize in ways that many could not. He was skilled with a gun, which meant he could defend himself and others if necessary. And he had connections to Sarah and Caleb, and through them to a wider network of people who wanted to see slavery ended. Matthew began to put his plan into action in the fall of 1856. His first target was not the Henderson plantation. Out of a complicated mixture of residual gratitude to Richard Henderson and practical calculation that attacking the plantation, where he was known, would be tactically unwise. Instead, he chose the Riverside Plantation, a massive operation about 30 miles to the east that was owned by a man named George Whitmore. Whitmore was known, even among plantation owners, for his cruelty, for the casual violence with which he treated the people he enslaved, and for his habit of separating families as punishment for even minor infractions. The Riverside Plantation held about 150 enslaved people, and Matthew, through careful reconnaissance over several weeks, identified 40 of them who were physically capable of making the journey to freedom and desperate enough to take the risk. The raid on Riverside Plantation happened on a moonless night in October. Matthew approached the slave quarters just after midnight, moving silently through the darkness, his gun tucked into his belt and his heart hammering in his chest despite the calm expression on his face. He had planned every detail meticulously. He knew which cabins held the people he had targeted, knew where the overseers slept, knew the patrol patterns of the men who guarded the property at night. He knocked softly on the first door, a specific pattern that Sarah had taught him, a signal that would identify him as a friend rather than a threat. The door opened slowly, and a face appeared in the gap, a woman named Martha whom Matthew had spoken to briefly during one of his visits to the plantation on the pretext of discussing a horse trade with Whitmore's stable master. She recognized him, and fear and hope warred in her expression as he explained quickly why he was there. He was offering a chance at freedom, he told her, but it had to be tonight, right now, and there was no guarantee of success. She could stay, or she could take the chance and run. Martha made her decision in seconds, waking her 2 children and gathering the few possessions she had while Matthew moved to the next cabin. Within an hour, 40 people had made the same choice Martha had, abandoning the only homes most of them had ever known for the uncertain promise of freedom. Matthew led them away from the plantation, moving quickly but carefully through the woods and fields, following routes he had scouted in advance. Behind them, he had left several small fires that he had set in strategic locations, nothing large enough to cause serious damage but enough to create confusion and draw the attention of the guards away from the slave quarters. By the time the alarm was raised and Whitmore realized what had happened, Matthew and the 40 refugees were 5 miles away and moving fast. The journey to safety took 3 days of hard traveling, moving mostly at night and hiding during the day in locations that Caleb and Sarah had identified as part of their underground network. Matthew led them to a series of safe houses, small farms and isolated cabins where sympathetic people provided food, rest, and medical attention to those who needed it. Not everyone made the complete journey. 3 of the older individuals decided to stay at one of the intermediate stops, too exhausted to continue and content to have made it even that far from the plantation. But the remaining 37 reached Caleb's farm, and from there they were passed along to other conductors on the Underground Railroad, beginning the long journey north to states where they could live as free people. Matthew returned to the Henderson plantation after that first raid with a sense of accomplishment that was tempered by the knowledge of how much more there was to do. Word of the Riverside incident spread quickly through the region, though no one initially connected it to Matthew. George Whitmore was furious, posting rewards for information about the missing enslaved people and pressuring local law enforcement to investigate. But the trail had gone cold, and without witnesses or evidence, there was little anyone could do except speculate about what had happened. Some thought it was the work of the Underground Railroad. Others suggested that the people had simply run off on their own in a coordinated escape. No one suspected that a single man had orchestrated the entire operation. But Matthew knew that he had been lucky, that the success of the first raid owed as much to surprise and careful preparation as to any skill on his part. He knew that if he was going to continue, if he was going to make this more than a one-time event, he would need to be smarter, more careful, and more ruthless in his planning. He spent the next several months refining his approach, learning from the mistakes and near misses of the Riverside operation. He recruited Sarah and Caleb more formally into his network, explaining his larger vision and asking for their help. Sarah agreed immediately, her fierce commitment to freedom overriding any concerns about the risks involved. Caleb was more hesitant, worried about the potential for violence and the likelihood that people would be killed if Matthew continued on this path. But in the end, he agreed as well, convinced by Matthew's argument that doing nothing was itself a form of violence, a tacit acceptance of a system that destroyed human lives and dignity. The second raid happened 3 months after the first, targeting the Morrison plantation about 40 miles south of Henderson's land. This time, Matthew freed 32 people, using the same tactics of nighttime approach, quick organization, and strategic distraction. But this raid was harder because plantation owners across the region had increased their security in the wake of the Riverside incident. Guards were more alert, dogs were used more frequently to patrol the grounds, and enslaved people were watched more closely for any signs of planning an escape. Matthew had to be more careful, more patient, and he had to accept that not everyone he wanted to free would be able to leave. 2 men who had agreed to go changed their minds at the last moment, afraid of the consequences if they were caught. Matthew respected their decision and left them behind, taking only those who were absolutely committed to taking the risk. It was after the Morrison raid that people began to notice a pattern. 2 large-scale escapes within a few months, both executed with a level of organization that suggested someone was coordinating them, both successful in ways that spontaneous escapes rarely were. Plantation owners began to talk among themselves, comparing notes and trying to figure out who was behind these incidents. Rewards were posted, not just for the return of specific enslaved individuals, but for information about the person or persons organizing these escapes. And law enforcement, such as it was in rural Texas in the 1850s, began to pay more attention, though their resources were limited and their interest in protecting the property of wealthy landowners had to be balanced against the practical difficulties of patrolling hundreds of square miles of countryside. It was around this time that Edwin Clarke entered the story. Clarke was a former soldier who had served in the Mexican-American War and had distinguished himself in several battles before being discharged in 1848 due to a leg wound that left him with a permanent limp. He had returned to Texas and established himself as a tracker and bounty hunter, skills that were in high demand in a region where enforcing the law often meant tracking down people who had fled rather than face justice or servitude. Clarke was in his early 40s, a lean, weathered man with cold blue eyes and a reputation for never giving up once he took on a case. He was not motivated by any particular love of slavery or hatred of those who fought against it. For him, it was simply business, a way to make a living using the skills he had developed over years of military service and frontier living. George Whitmore hired Clarke to investigate the Riverside escape and, if possible, to track down the people responsible. Clarke approached the task with the methodical thoroughness that had made him successful in his profession. He interviewed everyone who had been at the plantation the night of the escape, examined the physical evidence that remained, and began to piece together a picture of what had happened. He noted the fires that had been set as distractions, the pattern of movement through the slave quarters, the efficiency with which so many people had been organized and led away. This was not the work of amateurs, Clarke concluded. This was someone who knew what they were doing, someone with military or organizational training, someone who had scouted the location in advance and planned every detail. Clarke's investigation led him to question people at nearby plantations, to talk to merchants and travelers who might have seen something unusual in the weeks leading up to the raid. And slowly, through a process of elimination and careful analysis, he began to focus on a few potential suspects. One of these was Matthew Lawson, whose presence in the region, traveling between plantations on various errands for Richard Henderson, had been noted by several people. Clarke made inquiries about Matthew, learning about his unusual status as a freed slave who still lived and worked on Henderson's plantation, about his education and his skills with horses and guns. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was interesting, a thread that Clarke filed away in his mind as potentially significant. Matthew's third raid was against the Blackwood plantation in the spring of 1857, and it was during this operation that violence first entered into his activities in a direct way. He had led 45 people out of the slave quarters and was guiding them through the woods when they encountered a patrol that had been increased in the wake of the previous escapes. 3 armed men on horseback appeared suddenly on the path ahead, and for a moment, everyone froze. Matthew knew that if the alarm was raised now, before they were far enough from the plantation, the entire group would be caught and everyone, himself included, would face severe punishment or death. He made his decision in a fraction of a second. Drawing his revolver with a speed that surprised even himself, Matthew fired 3 shots in rapid succession. 2 of the guards fell from their horses immediately, struck in the chest and shoulder respectively. The third managed to turn his horse and begin to gallop away, but Matthew's 4th shot caught him in the back, and he slumped forward in the saddle before sliding to the ground. The entire encounter lasted less than 10 seconds. And then there was only the sound of the panicked horses crashing through the underbrush and the ragged breathing of 45 people who had just witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come. Matthew didn't pause to check on the fallen men or to explain what had just happened. He simply reloaded his revolver with steady hands and told everyone to keep moving. They needed to be miles away before the bodies were discovered, needed to reach the first safe house before dawn. The group followed him without question, their fear of what they had left behind now mixed with an awed respect for this man, who had just killed 3 white men without hesitation and seemed completely calm about it. The Blackwood raid changed everything. The deaths of the 3 guards transformed Matthew from an annoyance to plantation owners into an active threat, someone who was willing to use lethal force to achieve his goals. Wanted posters appeared throughout the region, though they had no accurate description of Matthew since he had always been careful to keep his face hidden or to work at night when identification was difficult. The reward for information leading to his capture jumped from $500 to $2,000, a fortune that made every bounty hunter and opportunist in Texas take notice. The posters themselves were crudely printed broadsheets that appeared on trees, in town squares, and on the walls of general stores and taverns. They described Matthew only in the most general terms, a black man of medium height and build, probably in his 20s or 30s, known to be skilled with firearms and horses. The vagueness of the description meant that many innocent free blacks, and even some enslaved people were harassed or detained by overzealous individuals hoping to claim the reward. This created additional tensions in communities throughout the region, as free blacks who had previously been able to move about with relative freedom now found themselves subject to increased scrutiny and suspicion. Matthew felt the weight of this unintended consequence, knowing that his actions were bringing hardship to people who had nothing to do with his operations. But he also recognized that the system itself was responsible for creating conditions where such injustices could occur. Edwin Clarke's investigation suddenly became much more urgent, and he was hired by a consortium of plantation owners to track down and capture or kill the person behind these raids. The consortium pooled resources, creating a fund of $10,000 that would be paid to Clarke upon successful completion of his mission. This was an extraordinary sum, reflecting both the economic damage the raids were causing and the psychological impact they were having on the slave-owning class. Clarke threw himself into the work with renewed focus, and his careful analysis of the patterns, the locations, and the methods used in each raid led him increasingly to suspect Matthew Lawson. But suspicion was not proof, and Clarke needed more before he could act. Clarke began a methodical investigation that demonstrated why he had earned his reputation as the best tracker in the region. He created detailed timelines of each raid, noting not just when they occurred, but what the weather had been like, what phase the moon was in, what other events were happening in the area that might have provided cover or distraction. He interviewed dozens of people, from plantation owners and overseers to merchants and travelers who might have seen something relevant. He studied the physical evidence left behind at raid sites, examining footprints and discarded items, looking for patterns that might provide clues about the raiders' identity or methods. He mapped out the escape routes that had been used, trying to identify common elements or strategic logic that might predict where future raids would occur. Through this painstaking process, Clarke began to build a profile of his quarry. This was someone educated, he concluded, based on the sophistication of the planning and the strategic thinking evident in the choice of targets and timing. This was someone with extensive knowledge of the region, familiar with back roads and hidden paths that most people didn't know existed. This was someone with military or paramilitary training, given the tactical discipline and the ability to organize and move large groups of people efficiently. And this was someone who had connections throughout the Black community and possibly among white abolitionists, because the logistics of moving hundreds of people to safety required a network that no individual could create alone. All of these factors pointed Clarke increasingly toward Matthew Lawson. Matthew's education was unusual for someone with his background, as was his freedom and his continued association with the Henderson plantation. His travels throughout the region on various errands gave him both the knowledge and the opportunity to scout targets and establish contacts. And his known connections to Sarah Jennings and Caleb Moore, both of whom were suspected of abolitionist sympathies, fit the profile of someone who would be part of an underground network. Clarke didn't have definitive proof, but his instincts told him he was on the right track, and his instincts had rarely been wrong in his long career as a tracker and investigator. Meanwhile, Matthew continued his operations with a grim determination that bordered on obsession. He raided the Thornton plantation in the summer of 1857, freeing 38 people. He struck the Richmond plantation that fall, leading 42 individuals to freedom. Each raid was meticulously planned, each escape route carefully scouted, each contingency considered and prepared for. And each time, he left behind small signs of his passage, things that other enslaved people would recognize as messages of hope. A particular arrangement of stones near a water pump, a piece of cloth tied to a tree branch in a specific pattern, these became symbols that Matthew Lawson had been there, that freedom was possible, that resistance was not futile. Sarah Jennings and Caleb Moore became indispensable to these operations. Sarah used her boarding house as a hub for information, gathering news about which plantations were buying new enslaved people, which owners were struggling financially, which overseers were particularly brutal. She also helped coordinate the safe houses along the routes Matthew used, ensuring that food, medical supplies, and shelter were available when needed. Caleb provided the physical infrastructure, his farm serving as the primary way station where people could rest for a few days before continuing their journey north. He also used his contacts in the Quaker community to establish connections further along the Underground Railroad, ensuring that those who reached his farm had a clear path to genuine freedom in the northern states or Canada. But the network was not without its failures and tragedies. During a raid on the Westfield plantation in early 1858, 2 people were killed when they stumbled into a trap that the owner had set after receiving warnings that his plantation might be targeted. Matthew managed to get the rest of the group away safely, but the deaths weighed on him heavily, a reminder that for all his planning and skill, he could not control everything, could not protect everyone. He attended a secret memorial service that Sarah organized, standing in the back of the room and listening as people spoke about the 2 who had died, about their courage and their desire for freedom. He said nothing himself, but his jaw was tight and his eyes were hard, and those who knew him understood that each death added to the burning determination that drove him forward. Edwin Clarke finally got his break in the spring of 1858 when one of his informants reported seeing a black man matching Matthew's description near the Riverside plantation just days before a raid that freed 35 people. Clarke began to focus his investigation exclusively on Matthew, tracking his movements and looking for patterns that would connect him definitively to the raids. He learned about Matthew's trips to Oak Ridge, about his relationship with Sarah Jennings, about the time he spent at Caleb Moore's farm. None of this was proof of criminal activity, but it created a picture of connections and opportunities that aligned suspiciously well with the timing and locations of the plantation raids. Clarke finally confronted Matthew in the late summer of 1858, riding up to the Henderson plantation and asking to speak with him. Richard Henderson, who by this point had heard the rumors about Matthew but had chosen to ignore them out of a complex mixture of denial and lingering gratitude, allowed the meeting. Clarke and Matthew sat on the porch of the main house, and Clarke laid out his suspicions in a calm, matter-of-fact voice. He had no proof, Clarke admitted, not yet. But he was certain that Matthew was involved, and he wanted to offer him a chance to stop before things got worse. The raids needed to end, Clarke said. Too many people were getting hurt, too much property was being lost, and the inevitable conclusion of this path was that Matthew would be caught and hanged. Matthew listened without expression, his face giving nothing away. When Clarke finished, Matthew asked a single question. How many plantations had he been accused of raiding? Clarke consulted his notes and said that Matthew was suspected of involvement in at least 12 separate incidents over the past 2 years. Matthew smiled then, a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes, and told Clarke that the number was wrong. It was actually 15, he said, and there would be more. He stood up, ending the conversation, and walked away, leaving Clarke sitting on the porch with the certain knowledge that he had just been issued a challenge. The confrontation with Clarke marked a turning point for Matthew. He knew now that he was being actively hunted, that his time operating in relative anonymity was coming to an end. He made the decision to leave the Henderson plantation permanently, thanking Richard Henderson for the opportunities he had provided, but explaining that it was time to move on. Henderson, faced with mounting pressure from other plantation owners and increasingly disturbed by the implications of what Matthew had been doing, did not object. He gave Matthew a horse, a good saddle, and $100 in cash, more than he owed but less than he felt his life had been worth. They shook hands, and Matthew rode away from the only home he had ever known, heading toward a future that was uncertain but entirely of his own making. Matthew established himself in Oak Ridge, taking a room at Sarah's boarding house and using it as his base of operations. He stopped trying to hide his activities, instead becoming openly defiant in his mission to free as many enslaved people as possible. His raids became more frequent and more bold. He struck the Patterson plantation, the Cookfield property, the massive Johnson estate that stretched across 5,000 acres. Each raid was successful, and each added to his growing legend. Stories about Matthew Lawson spread throughout the slave-holding regions of Texas, whispered in quarters and debated in great houses. Some said he was 7 feet tall and could see in the dark like a cat. Others claimed he could talk to animals, and that's how he avoided the guard dogs. Still others insisted he had supernatural help, that he was protected by spirits or by God himself. The truth was both simpler and more impressive than the legends. Matthew succeeded because he was intelligent, disciplined, and utterly committed to his cause. He studied each plantation for weeks before striking, learning the routines, identifying the weak points, planning multiple escape routes in case the primary one was blocked. He worked with Sarah and Caleb to ensure that resources were in place, that safe houses were ready, that people along the Underground Railroad knew when to expect refugees. And he was willing to use violence when necessary, his reputation as a deadly shot ensuring that many potential pursuers thought twice before engaging him directly. By 1859, Matthew had freed people from 25 plantations, and the number of armed men actively searching for him had grown to over 100. Posses were organized, bounty hunters were hired, and rewards reached astronomical amounts. George Whitmore personally offered $5,000 for Matthew's capture, dead or alive. But despite this massive effort, Matthew remained free, continuing his operations with a consistency that frustrated and frightened those trying to stop him. Edwin Clarke became obsessed with catching Matthew, viewing it as a personal challenge as much as a professional obligation. He studied Matthew's patterns, trying to predict where he would strike next. He laid traps, positioning men at plantations he thought were likely targets. But Matthew seemed to have an uncanny ability to avoid these traps, striking instead at locations that Clarke had deemed less likely. The two men engaged in a cat-and-mouse game that lasted for months, with Clarke always seeming to be one step behind despite his best efforts. The scale of Matthew's operations expanded in ways that made them qualitatively different from typical Underground Railroad activities. Instead of helping a few individuals at a time, he was now moving groups of 30 to 50 people in single operations. He had established multiple routes to freedom, not relying on any single path that could be blocked or discovered. And he had recruited others to help, not as active participants in the raids themselves, but as support network members who provided information, resources, and safe havens. One of Matthew's most audacious raids came in the fall of 1859 when he targeted the Livingston Plantation, one of the largest in Texas with over 300 enslaved people working its vast cotton fields. The Livingston family was wealthy and politically connected, with close ties to state government officials. Raiding their property was not just a tactical operation, but a political statement, a direct challenge to the power structure that sustained slavery. Matthew spent 6 weeks preparing for this raid, longer than he had spent on any previous operation, and he knew that the level of security would be higher than anything he had faced before. The Livingston raid was also notable because it was the first time Matthew directly confronted the moral complexity of his actions in a way he couldn't avoid. Among the people he freed from the Livingston plantation was a woman named Grace who was 8 months pregnant. Matthew had initially planned to leave her behind, knowing that the journey would be too dangerous for someone so close to giving birth. But Grace begged to be included, explaining that her owner had already decided to sell her baby once it was born, separating mother and child as punishment for what he considered Grace's rebellious attitude. She would rather die trying to reach freedom, she told Matthew, than stay and lose her child. Matthew agreed to include her, but it complicated everything. The group had to move more slowly, had to take more frequent breaks, had to be even more careful about avoiding pursuit. 2 days into the journey, Grace went into labor at one of the safe houses. Matthew, Sarah, and a midwife who was part of their network helped Grace through a difficult birth that lasted 18 hours. The baby, a girl that Grace named Hope, survived, and 3 days later, mother and infant continued the journey north. That single incident, witnessing new life beginning in the midst of his fight for freedom, affected Matthew deeply in ways he had trouble articulating even to himself. By the beginning of 1860, Matthew had conducted raids on 32 plantations and had freed over 1,300 people. The political landscape was changing as well, with tensions between slaveholding and free states reaching a breaking point. The election of Abraham Lincoln in November of 1860 would lead directly to secession and civil war, but even before that, the fault lines were clear. Matthew's activities, while small in the context of the vast system of slavery, had become symbolic of a larger struggle, a refusal to accept the status quo and a willingness to fight for change regardless of the cost. The number of men hunting Matthew had grown to over 200 by this point, organized into several large posses that roamed the countryside looking for him. Edwin Clarke led the largest of these groups, a force of 50 well-armed men who were committed to tracking Matthew down. Clarke had become something of a celebrity in pro-slavery circles, the man who would finally bring the notorious Matthew Lawson to justice. But despite the resources at his disposal, despite the informants and the rewards and the political pressure, Clarke remained unable to capture his quarry. Part of the reason for Matthew's continued success was his willingness to adapt and evolve his tactics. He began staging false raids, operations that looked like his work but that he had not actually conducted, designed to confuse pursuers and spread their resources thin. He used multiple disguises, sometimes posing as a slave traveling with a pass, other times as a free black man on legitimate business. He established decoy safe houses, locations that appeared to be part of his network, but that were actually empty or that would lead pursuers away from the real routes he was using. And he continued to expand his actual network, recruiting new people and establishing new connections that made the system more resilient and harder to disrupt. Sarah Jennings faced increasing scrutiny during this period, with local authorities suspecting her involvement but unable to prove anything concrete. Her boarding house was searched multiple times, and she was questioned extensively about her relationship with Matthew. But Sarah was as careful and intelligent as Matthew himself, and she never gave the authorities anything they could use. She maintained her innocence, claiming that she was simply running a business and that she had no knowledge of any illegal activities. The fact that she was a free black woman with legal papers and a legitimate enterprise made it difficult for authorities to move against her without solid evidence. Caleb Moore also came under suspicion, and there were calls from some quarters to arrest him simply for being a known abolitionist. But Caleb had powerful friends in the Quaker community, including some who had connections to politicians and judges, and these connections provided him with a degree of protection. He was careful never to be caught actually harboring fugitives, timing the arrivals and departures from his farm so that no one could be found there during searches. Like Sarah, he maintained his innocence and challenged authorities to prove their accusations. Matthew's 37th raid, conducted in the spring of 1861 just after the outbreak of the Civil War, targeted the Riverside Plantation for a second time. George Whitmore had restocked his plantation after the first raid, purchasing new enslaved people to replace those who had been freed, and Matthew decided that this was unacceptable. The second Riverside raid was particularly satisfying for Matthew, not just because he freed 38 people, but because he left a message for Whitmore, a note tacked to the door of the main house that simply said, "You cannot replace what I take. Each person is worth more than your entire estate." Matthew Lawson. It was an uncharacteristic moment of open defiance, signing his name to a raid for the first time, and it demonstrated the confidence Matthew had developed after years of successful operations. He was no longer trying to hide his identity or to avoid attribution. He wanted people to know who was doing this, wanted enslaved people to know that resistance was possible and that someone was fighting for their freedom, wanted plantation owners to know that their property and their way of life were under active attack. The Civil War changed the context of Matthew's activities in complex ways. On one hand, the conflict between Union and Confederate forces created opportunities, as attention and resources were diverted to the war effort and away from tracking down individual activists like Matthew. On the other hand, the war also hardened attitudes and increased the stakes, with Confederate authorities viewing people like Matthew not just as criminals, but as enemy agents undermining the war effort. The penalties for being caught increased dramatically, and the likelihood of being executed rather than imprisoned became much higher. Matthew continued his operations through the first year of the war, conducting raids on plantations in Texas and Louisiana. His 38th, 39th, and 40th raids were all successful, freeing a total of 112 people. But the war also meant that some of the routes to freedom became more dangerous or impossible to use, as battle lines shifted and territories changed hands. Matthew had to develop new routes, establish new safe houses, and adapt to a rapidly changing situation. The 40th raid, which would prove to be Matthew's last, occurred in the winter of 1862. The target was a plantation near the Louisiana border, a medium-sized operation owned by a man named Henry Ashford. The raid itself went smoothly, with Matthew freeing 41 people and leading them away from the plantation without any immediate pursuit. But Edwin Clarke had finally managed to anticipate Matthew's movement, analyzing patterns and making an educated guess about where he would strike next. Clarke and his posse of 60 men were waiting along one of the escape routes, positioned in the woods about 10 miles from the Ashford plantation. The ambush happened just before dawn, as Matthew and the refugees were moving through a dense forest following a path that he had used successfully on previous operations. Clarke's men opened fire from concealed positions, and the quiet morning exploded into chaos. Matthew returned fire immediately, his revolver barking in the pre-dawn darkness, and he shouted for everyone to scatter and run. The refugees fled in all directions, some making it to safety while others were caught or killed in the initial volley of shots. Matthew stood his ground, providing covering fire and trying to buy time for as many people as possible to escape. The gunfight lasted perhaps 5 minutes, though it felt like hours to those involved. Matthew was hit twice, once in the left shoulder and once in the side, but he continued to fight, his marksmanship and his determination making him a terrifying opponent even while wounded. He managed to kill or wound several of Clarke's men, and his accurate fire forced the rest to take cover and approach more cautiously. But he was outnumbered and bleeding, and he knew that he could not win this fight. Matthew made his decision quickly, as he had always done. He fired his remaining shots to keep Clarke's men pinned down, then turned and ran deeper into the forest. He could hear pursuit behind him, could hear Clarke's voice shouting orders, could hear the crashing of men moving through the underbrush. But he also knew these woods, had scouted them during his planning for the raid, and he used every trick he had learned over years of evading capture. He waded through a stream to break his scent trail, climbed trees, and moved through the branches to avoid leaving tracks, doubled back on his own trail to confuse pursuers. And slowly, painfully, he managed to lose them. Matthew eventually made it to one of Caleb's safe houses, a small cabin hidden deep in the woods about 20 miles from the ambush site. He collapsed when he arrived, his wounds having bled profusely during the flight, and he spent the next 2 weeks hovering between life and death as Sarah and Caleb cared for him. The bullet in his shoulder had passed through cleanly, but the one in his side had struck a rib and fragmented, creating internal damage that required careful treatment. Sarah, who had learned basic medical care over her years of helping refugees, removed the bullet fragments and stitched the wounds closed, then fought off the infection that inevitably developed. While Matthew recovered, news of the ambush and his apparent escape spread throughout the region. Clarke reported that Matthew had been wounded, possibly fatally, and that he was confident the fugitive would be captured or would die from his injuries. Rewards for information about Matthew's location were increased again, reaching the staggering sum of $10,000, enough money to make even close friends consider betrayal. Patrols were intensified, and every safe house and known associate was watched carefully. But Matthew survived, his tough constitution and the excellent care he received allowing him to recover from wounds that would have killed many other men. When he was finally able to stand and walk without collapsing, he faced a crucial decision about what to do next. He had freed people from 40 plantations over a 10-year period. He had become a legend, a symbol of resistance that inspired some and terrified others. But the war was changing everything, and the practical question was whether continuing his raids served any purpose given the larger conflict that would ultimately determine the fate of slavery itself. Matthew talked extensively with Sarah and Caleb during his recovery, discussing the situation and trying to decide on the best course of action. Sarah argued that his work was more important than ever, that even with the war raging, enslaved people needed to see that someone was fighting for them. Caleb took a more pragmatic view, suggesting that Matthew's talents might be better used working with Union forces, providing intelligence, or helping to recruit former slaves into military service. Matthew listened to both perspectives, but ultimately made his own decision. He chose to stop the raids, at least temporarily, acknowledging that his injuries had slowed him down and that the increased security and attention made further operations too risky. But he did not disappear entirely. Instead, he transformed his network into something different, using it to gather and pass intelligence to Union forces about Confederate troop movements, supply lines, and plantation locations that could be targeted for liberation by military units. He worked with Sarah and Caleb to continue helping individual refugees reach freedom, though without the large-scale raids that had defined his earlier work. And he began documenting his experiences, working with Sarah to record the stories of the people he had helped free, creating a testament to the human cost of slavery and the resistance that had been mounted against it. Edwin Clarke never stopped hunting Matthew, continuing to pursue leads and investigate sightings throughout the war years. The two men never met face-to-face again after the ambush, though Clarke came close on several occasions. The obsession consumed Clarke, damaging his health and his relationships, and he died in 1864, possibly from a heart attack, though some speculated that the stress and frustration of his failed pursuit had contributed to his early death. When Matthew heard the news, he felt no triumph, only a weary sadness at the waste of it all, at the fact that a skilled and determined man like Clarke had spent the last years of his life in service of a system that was fundamentally evil. The Civil War ended in 1865, and with it, the legal institution of slavery in the United States. Matthew was 36 years old, scarred by his experiences but alive and free in a way that would have been unimaginable when he had been born into bondage. He continued to work with Sarah and Caleb in the aftermath of the war, helping newly freed people adjust to their changed circumstances, providing education and resources, and advocating for the rights that had been promised but not always delivered. Matthew never sought public recognition for what he had done. He refused interviews, declined to write a memoir despite numerous requests, and avoided the lecture circuit where other abolitionists and activists were making their stories known. He preferred to work quietly, to help individuals rather than to seek fame or glory. But the stories about him persisted, passed down through generations of people whose ancestors he had freed, embellished and mythologized over time until the real Matthew Lawson became almost impossible to separate from the legend. The final accounting of Matthew's decade of raids showed that he had directly freed over 1,700 people from 40 plantations. Countless others had been inspired by his example to seek their own freedom or to resist their bondage in whatever ways they could. And the network he had built, the safe houses and routes and connections between people committed to ending slavery, had helped many more beyond those directly involved in his operations. The estimate of 200 armed men who were afraid to chase him was, if anything, conservative. The reputation he had built, the demonstration that one determined individual could strike at the heart of the slave system and survive, had created a fear among slaveholders that went beyond the practical concern about losing property. It challenged their fundamental assumption that they were in control, that their system was stable and unchallengeable. Sarah Jennings continued to run her boarding house for many years after the war, using it as a community center and a hub for newly freed people seeking education and opportunities. She married a teacher from the North who came to Texas to help with Reconstruction efforts, and together they established a school for Black children that operated for over 30 years. Sarah remained in contact with Matthew until her death in 1892, and her personal papers, donated to a historical society, included extensive correspondence that provided invaluable documentation of the Underground Railroad network in Texas. Caleb Moore returned to Pennsylvania after the war, his health broken by the stress and danger of his years in Texas. He lived with his sister's family and spent his final years writing about his experiences and advocating for continued efforts to ensure that the promises of emancipation were fulfilled. His farm in Texas was burned down by Confederate sympathizers near the end of the war, but he never regretted the choices he had made or the risks he had taken. Matthew Lawson lived until 1904, dying at the age of 75 in a small house in Kansas that he had purchased with money saved from various jobs he had worked over the decades. He never married, though he maintained close friendships with many people, particularly those he had freed or worked with during his years of active resistance. In his later years, he occasionally spoke to small groups about his experiences, and these talks were marked by his insistence on the ordinary nature of what he had done. He was not a hero, he would tell audiences. He was simply someone who had refused to accept injustice, who had used the skills and opportunities available to him to fight against a system that destroyed human dignity. Anyone could have done what he did, he maintained, if they had been willing to take the risk and pay the cost. The truth, of course, was more complex. Very few people could have done what Matthew did, could have sustained a decade-long campaign of resistance against overwhelming opposition, could have freed nearly 2,000 people while remaining alive and free themselves. His combination of intelligence, skill, discipline, and absolute commitment was rare, perhaps unique. But his insistence on the accessibility of resistance, on the idea that ordinary people could make a difference through courage and determination, was itself an important legacy, a message that inspired subsequent generations of activists and resistors. The story of Matthew Lawson, the slave-turned-gunman who freed 40 plantations and left 200 men afraid to chase him, became part of American folklore, told and retold in different versions, adapted and changed to suit different purposes and audiences. Some versions emphasized his skill with a gun, turning him into a kind of Old West gunfighter. Others focused on his role in the Underground Railroad, making him a symbol of organized resistance. Still others highlighted his intelligence and planning, presenting him as a strategic genius who outwitted his opponents. All of these versions contained elements of truth, but they also missed something essential about who Matthew really was. At his core, Matthew Lawson was someone who had understood from personal experience the fundamental injustice of slavery, who had been given an unexpected opportunity to fight against it, and who had chosen to dedicate himself fully to that fight regardless of the personal cost. He was not driven by hatred of slave owners, though he certainly had reason to hate them. He was not motivated by a desire for revenge, though again he would have been justified in seeking it. Instead, he was compelled by a vision of what freedom meant, by a belief that every person deserved the right to control their own life, and by a recognition that sometimes the only way to achieve justice was through direct action that defied unjust laws. The plantations he raided never fully recovered from his strikes. The freed people he led to safety built new lives in the North, raised families, established communities, and contributed to the slow, difficult work of building a more just society. The network he created, with Sarah and Caleb and dozens of others, demonstrated that resistance was possible even in the heart of slave territory, even when the odds seemed overwhelming. And the fear he instilled in those who profited from slavery, the knowledge that they were not as secure as they had believed, contributed in some small way to the eventual collapse of the system they defended. When Matthew died in 1904, only a handful of people attended his funeral. He had outlived most of his contemporaries, and the younger generation knew him only as an old man who occasionally told stories about the past. But those who were there, who understood what he had accomplished and what it had cost him, knew that they were saying goodbye to someone truly remarkable. They buried him in a simple grave marked with a plain stone that bore only his name and dates. There was no mention of his deeds, no list of his accomplishments, nothing to indicate that this grave held a man who had changed the lives of thousands. But the people he had freed remembered. Their children remembered. Their grandchildren remembered. And the story passed down through generations, kept alive in family histories and community traditions, ensuring that Matthew Lawson would not be forgotten. He had been a slave who became free, a free man who became a fighter, and a fighter who became a legend. More importantly, he had been living proof that the system of slavery, for all its power and violence and institutional support, could be resisted, could be fought, and could ultimately be defeated. The 40 plantations he struck represented just a tiny fraction of the thousands that existed across the South. The nearly 2,000 people he freed represented only a small portion of the millions held in bondage. But numbers alone do not tell the complete story. What Matthew Lawson demonstrated was that resistance was possible, that one person with courage and determination could make a difference, and that the fight for justice was worth any sacrifice. These lessons resonated far beyond the specific context of his time and place, becoming part of a larger American story about freedom, resistance, and the ongoing struggle to make the promises of liberty real for everyone. In the end, Matthew Lawson's greatest legacy may not have been the specific people he freed or the specific plantations he raided, though those accomplishments were significant. Rather, it was the example he set, the demonstration that ordinary people facing extraordinary injustice do not have to accept their circumstances passively. They can fight back, can organize, can resist, and can sometimes win. That message, carried forward by the people whose lives he touched and by the stories that kept his memory alive, proved to be one of the most powerful weapons against oppression in all its forms. The man who had once been property, who had saved his owner's life and gained his freedom, who had then chosen to use that freedom to fight for others still in chains, died peacefully in his sleep on a cold winter night in Kansas. His last years had been quiet ones, marked by simple pleasures and the satisfaction of having lived according to his principles. He had no wealth to speak of, no famous descendants, no monuments built in his honor. But he had something more valuable than any of those things. He had the knowledge that he had made a difference, that he had fought the good fight, and that because of his actions, hundreds of families had been given the chance to live free. For Matthew Lawson, that was enough. It had always been enough. And in the final analysis, it was everything.